Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The Encounter ***. Captain Leo Daniels had never expected a simple mission to rescue an alien species from slavery would turn into something much more complicated. He had spent the last 3 years in deep space as a part of the Human Defense Fleet, protecting humanity from the predations of the alien forces that lurked in the dark void. But today something felt different. Today he was about to encounter an alien he would never forget. The mission was straightforward: a raid on a desolate planet in a far-flung sector of the galaxy, where the Slavers Guild operated a lucrative trade in captured beings. Leo's team had been briefed on the location and tactical setup, and it was supposed to be a clean extraction. However, nothing ever went as planned in the galaxy. The squad breached the compound, their boots thudding heavily on the metal floors as they moved swiftly through the corridors. Weapons raised, eyes scanning every corner. Then they found her, locked away in a cage. She was unlike anything Leo had ever seen before. Tall, with translucent skin that shimmered in the dim light, her elongated limbs were decorated with tattoos that seemed to pulse faintly with some kind of energy. Her eyes, large and alien, gleamed with an intensity that belied the terror she had likely endured. The slavers had stripped her of her dignity, chaining her to a steel bed frame, leaving her nothing but her own survival instincts. Leo's heart clenched at the sight. Despite the cold, emotionless professionalism he tried to maintain, he couldn't help but feel a surge of compassion. This wasn't just a mission to him. This was someone's life, someone who had been reduced to a mere object in the eyes of those who trafficked in suffering. "Clear," one of his teammates called out as they swept the room, confirming no immediate threats. Leo stepped forward, his hand resting on the cage door. He didn't wait for orders. With a single swipe, he deactivated the locking mechanism. The alien girl didn't speak, but her eyes locked onto his, a mixture of relief and wariness flashing in her gaze. She had been through more than any being should ever endure, and now in front of her stood a human, a stranger but also her liberator. "I won't leave you," Leo whispered, though he wasn't sure why he said it. Something about her, something about the situation, made him vow to protect her, even if he couldn't fully comprehend why. She didn't respond immediately, her alien mind still trying to grasp the enormity of the rescue. But then a small, broken smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw like a sound made for the first time. Unfamiliar territory ***. The days that followed were filled with questions, on both sides. Leo's ship, the Aegis, was quiet, the crew handling the aftermath of the mission in their usual no-nonsense way. But Leo couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper to the bond that had been formed in that dusty cell. His shipmates noticed it too, but no one dared comment, understanding the unspoken complexity of the situation. As the alien girl recovered physically, Leo made it a point to learn more about her. He had no translator device, but with time they learned to communicate in a basic form. She was called Naira, a name that sounded like a melody when she said it. She was from a world far beyond the reach of the human race, a world that had fallen under the thumb of the Slavers Guild for generations. Her species, once proud and independent, had been subjugated and sold like cattle. She didn't ask for anything, only to be left alone in the quiet corners of the ship. But Leo couldn't help but wonder how long that would last. Every time he checked in on her, he saw the hollow look in her eyes, the fear that still gripped her heart. There was no escape from the memories she carried. Leo kept his distance out of respect for her trauma, but he was always within reach should she need help. And soon she began to need him more than either of them could have anticipated. One evening, as the ship glided through the deep space lanes, Leo was summoned to the bridge by his first officer, Lieutenant Vega. "Captain," Vega said, her voice laced with concern. "We've received a distress signal from a nearby system. It's a human colony." Leo's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for colonies to send distress signals, but this one came from an area long believed to be under the control of the Slavers Guild. "Are we going to check it out?" Leo asked, his hand already reaching for his jacket. Vega nodded. "We have to. We can't ignore it." The urgency in her voice sent a shiver down his spine. As he turned to leave the bridge, he saw Naira standing in the doorway. She had heard their conversation. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm, though her body still trembled from the trauma she had endured. Leo hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had just begun to recover. Did she really understand the danger she was walking into? "You're not ready," he said gently, though his own voice lacked conviction. He knew she wasn't just asking for physical freedom, she was asking for something far more complex. Naira didn't take no for an answer. I want to help, she insisted, her eyes blazing with a strength he hadn't seen before. Something about her resolve hit him deep. She wasn't just looking for protection, she was looking for her own purpose. Something to fight for. All right, Leo said finally. You can come. But stay behind me. As they prepped for the mission, Leo felt a strange sense of partnership blossoming between them. Naira wasn't just some alien he had saved. She was a force of nature, and together they would fight not just for her freedom, but for the future of every slave still trapped in the galaxy's darkest corners. The Aegis set course for the distress signal. But Leo couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle, one far deeper than they could imagine, was just beginning. Part 2, Unfamiliar Territory, continued. As the Aegis coasted through the empty expanse of space, Leo found himself unable to focus on anything other than Naira. Her presence, though still quiet and reserved, seemed to permeate the ship, even in the most routine moments. He could feel her gaze on him when she thought he wasn't looking, and he knew she was studying him just as intently as he was her. It was an unspoken connection that neither fully understood, but both were undeniably aware of. The journey to the colony took several days. During that time, Naira spent most of her hours in her room, often retreating into silence. Leo tried not to intrude, though he occasionally left her small trinkets from his travels, a piece of alien technology he'd scavenged, a book from Earth's archives, or something as simple as a fruit he'd never seen before. Each time, Naira received them with a soft, hesitant smile that made Leo feel both glad and for some reason guilty. His guilt stemmed from something he couldn't quite place. He knew what he'd done for her, rescued her from the horrors of slavery, but he also knew she was struggling with the feeling of being out of place. The human world was strange to her, just as her world was strange to him. She didn't belong on his ship. She had been a captive, a prisoner, a thing traded for profit and never once considered to be of value outside her role as a commodity. The freedom she now experienced was new, but it came with its own set of challenges. Leo couldn't help but feel responsible for that. He had broken the chains that bound her body, but he wasn't sure how to heal the damage done to her mind. The scars left by slavery weren't easily erased. But as the days passed, Leo noticed something in Naira that stirred his heart, her tenacity. Despite her trauma, she had a strength that he couldn't deny. She wasn't just a survivor, she was someone who had lived through something unfathomable, and yet her will to fight hadn't been broken. There were moments when he'd catch her staring out at the stars, her eyes full of longing and determination, and he'd realize that Naira had more resolve in her small alien frame than most people Leo had met in his life. When the distress signal finally came into range, Leo couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The coordinates placed them on the outskirts of the Veridon system, a human colony established decades ago, but reports indicated that the colony was under attack. The Slavers Guild had expanded their reach into the outer rims of human settlements, exploiting the vulnerabilities of isolated worlds. The danger was real. We're approaching the colony, Vega announced, her voice steady, yet strained with concern. Captain, we need a plan. Leo nodded and turned to the crew, scanning the holographic display of the colony's surface. Prepare for immediate deployment. We'll split into teams. My team will lead the assault on the ground, and Vega, I want you to coordinate from here. We need to keep the slavers from extracting any prisoners. We're ready, Captain, Vega replied, her eyes flashing with determination. Before Leo could move toward the shuttle bay, he felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Naira. I'm coming with you, she said again, her voice quieter but no less determined than before. Leo paused, considering her words. He could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just asking for permission, she was demanding to be part of this. Part of something bigger than herself. Something beyond the constraints of her past. Naira. Leo began, but he trailed off as he saw the pleading look in her eyes. He had already decided what she was going to do even before she'd spoken, but he needed to be sure. You're not ready for this. It's dangerous and you've only just started to recover. I've seen death, Naira interrupted, her voice raw but resolute. I've lived in the shadows of it for as long as I can remember. You're human and I may not understand everything about your world, but I understand war. I understand survival. Please, Leo, let me fight. Let me show you what I'm capable of. Her words struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement of fact. She wasn't asking for his protection, she was demanding a chance to take control of her own fate. Leo felt a strange respect for her, but more than that, he saw something in her, something he recognized in himself. A need to fight. A need to prove that they were more than what they had been forced to become. Leo studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Naira. You're with me." As they geared up for the mission, Leo felt a surge of responsibility toward Naira, but it wasn't just protective instinct. It was something deeper. She had become more than just a rescued alien. She was someone he would fight beside. Someone he had come to trust. The Aegis touched down on the outskirts of the colony, its massive landing gear sinking into the earth with a soft thud. The world around them was a mess of overgrown vegetation and scattered buildings, their structures still standing but abandoned. Smoke billowed in the distance, rising into the air like a warning. The slavers were here. "We've got company," Vega's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, the slavers are already on the move. We're picking up large groups of them heading toward the extraction point." Leo's heart skipped a beat. The slavers weren't just raiding, they were taking prisoners, likely human workers who had no chance of escape. He felt the cold surge of fury rise in his chest, the kind of anger that had fueled countless missions in the past. This wasn't just a rescue, this was retribution. Leo's team disembarked, Naira at his side, and they moved through the colony's perimeter with military precision. The trees around them were dense, their foliage heavy, making it difficult to spot any immediate threats. But Leo's instincts told him they were close. The slavers were good at blending in, using the terrain to their advantage. Suddenly the air exploded with gunfire. Leo's team returned fire, weapons flashing in the darkened atmosphere. Naira moved beside him, her alien agility making her a blur of motion as she expertly darted between trees and rocks, firing with precision. Leo's heart raced as he watched her in action. She was no longer the frightened alien he had rescued, she was a warrior. As they advanced toward the slavers' extraction point, the sound of blasters echoed in the distance. Leo's team was making progress, but so were the slavers. There was no turning back now. And as the first slaver appeared before them, a monstrous figure wielding an energy whip, Leo knew one thing for sure. The real battle for Naira's freedom, and for their future, had only just begun. The battle for freedom ***. The slaver stood tall, a hulking figure draped in dark, armor-like clothing, his face concealed behind a metal mask. The energy whip in his hand crackled with violet energy, buzzing in the air like a living thing. His eyes, barely visible through the slits in his helmet, were cold, unfeeling, as though the idea of mercy or compassion was foreign to him. "Engage," Leo barked, his voice sharp and authoritative, a command that rang through his team. The firefight that erupted was brutal and unforgiving. Naira, standing at Leo's side, moved with an eerie grace. Her alien reflexes were far superior to anything Leo had encountered from human soldiers. She ducked, rolled, and shot with deadly precision, each movement fluid and practiced despite her relative inexperience with the human weapons. "Nice shot," Leo muttered under his breath as Naira downed one of the slavers with a single well-placed shot to the chest. Her eyes, those large, mesmerizing alien eyes, glinted with an intensity that spoke of both pain and power. The slavers fought back with ruthless efficiency. Their weapons were high-tech, and they used guerrilla tactics, hiding behind cover, emerging only to unleash volleys of plasma fire before retreating again. They knew how to fight, and they knew how to exploit the weaknesses of their prey. But Leo's team wasn't going to be easy prey. The battle waged on as the two sides traded fire. Leo was in the thick of it, shouting orders, keeping his men in line, and ensuring that they didn't get overwhelmed. His mind raced through the strategies, calculating moves, predicting the enemy's actions. But as he did, he couldn't help but keep an eye on Naira. She was exceptional. She was more than he could have ever imagined, her movements a blend of animal instinct and calculated precision. It was as though she had been born to fight. Every motion spoke of a deep, primal understanding of warfare, one that had been forged through years of suffering and survival. "Incoming." Vega's voice crackled through the comms, her tone urgent. Leo barely had time to react before he saw the slaver leader swing his energy whip toward Naira. The whip hissed through the air with unnatural speed. Leo's heart skipped a beat as he saw Naira turn, her eyes wide with realization. Instinctively, Leo moved. Without thinking, he threw himself in front of her, just in time to see the whip crack against his side. The pain was immediate, sharp and searing, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped him as he saw Naira's face. She reached out, her hands trembling. "Leo," she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the crack of blaster fire and the chaos around them. The impact of the whip left a charred mark on his armor, but it didn't breach the protective layer. Leo gritted his teeth, refusing to show any weakness. This wasn't the time to falter. The battle wasn't over yet. The slaver leader swung again, but this time Leo was ready. He raised his blaster and fired. The shot was quick, direct, and it struck the slaver's whip hand with a satisfying crack. The energy whip dropped to the ground, sparking violently, and the slaver leader staggered back, stunned. Naira, who had been frozen in fear at Leo's close call, snapped into action. Without a moment's hesitation, she darted forward, her long legs carrying her with terrifying speed. She grabbed the fallen whip, her fingers wrapping around the hilt, and with a single fluid motion, she swung it at the slaver leader. The whip crackled, singing through the air like a thunderclap. It wrapped around the slaver's neck, and Naira yanked with all her strength, pulling him toward her. The slaver tried to struggle, but Naira's grip was unyielding, her alien strength evident in every movement. Leo watched in stunned silence as Naira dispatched the slaver leader with a force he hadn't expected. The crack of bone and the thud of the leader's body hitting the ground were unmistakable. "Well damn," Leo muttered to himself, a grin forming despite the chaos around him. He had never seen anything like it. Naira wasn't just a survivor, she was a force to be reckoned with. The rest of the slavers, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Some tried to retreat, but Leo and his team closed in on them. With the slaver leader dead, the remaining raiders were disorganized, panicked. The human soldiers were trained for moments like this, and they wasted no time in dispatching the remaining threats. "Area secure," Vega's voice came over the comms. "The slavers are retreating. We've got the colony in our sights." Leo took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his brow as the adrenaline began to fade. His side still ached from the whip's impact, but he pushed through it, focusing on the task at hand. He turned to Naira, who was standing near the fallen slaver leader, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. Her eyes were wide with shock, but there was no hesitation in her posture. She had just killed for the first time since Leo had found her, and there was no guilt in her expression, only resolve. "Are you okay?" Leo asked, his voice quieter now, the usual tension of command slipping away. Naira's gaze softened as she met his eyes. I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "I had to do it. He was going to kill you." Leo couldn't help but admire her. She had faced her own demons, and in that moment she had done what was necessary without question. She was no longer the broken alien he had rescued. She had found her place in this fight. "Thanks," Leo said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved my life." Naira simply nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that passed between them. A mutual understanding. They were in this together. Vega's voice broke the moment, her tone firm but not without a touch of respect. "Captain, we've got civilians gathered near the extraction point. They're in need of medical assistance. We also need to find out what happened to the rest of the slavers' forces." Leo's military instincts kicked back in. "Move in. We'll assist the civilians. Naira, stay close. We're not done yet." As they made their way toward the extraction point, Leo felt a new weight settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just leading a team, he was leading someone who had become more than just an ally. Naira had found her own purpose, and in the process she had become integral to his mission, to the fight for freedom. The battle wasn't over. The slavers would regroup and the war would continue. But for the first time in a long while, Leo felt as though the odds might be in their favor. And as they entered the colony's main square, surrounded by terrified civilians and the lingering smoke of battle, Leo knew that this moment, this partnership, would shape the future in ways neither of them could yet understand. It was just the beginning. The price of freedom ***. The colony was a mess. Blackened walls, shattered windows, and the pungent scent of burnt earth lingered in the air. The civilians, mostly human workers and their families, huddled together near the central square, their faces etched with fear. Some were injured, their wounds bandaged hastily by the few medical officers that had managed to escape the initial onslaught. The sound of distant gunfire still echoed from the far side of the settlement, the remnants of the slavers' forces still clashing with the local defense squads. But for Leo, the immediate priority was the civilians. As his team moved toward them, he signaled for Naira to stay close. "You okay?" he asked her quietly as they walked through the chaos. Naira, her face flushed with adrenaline, gave a sharp nod. "I'm fine. We need to get them out of here." Her voice was firm, but there was an edge to it, a hint of something darker beneath the calm exterior. Leo noticed it, but for now he didn't press her on it. They had more pressing concerns. Vega moved to Leo's side, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Captain, there are at least 24 civilians here, but we've got reports of more hiding in the buildings. We'll need to clear the area and get them to the extraction zone." Leo nodded. We'll have to move fast. We don't know how many more slavers are out there. They moved quickly, rounding up the civilians and guiding them toward the extraction point. Leo kept his eyes trained on the horizon, scanning for any signs of enemy movement. The slavers were crafty. They might have retreated temporarily, but they would regroup and strike again. That much Leo knew. Naira was silent by his side, her eyes darting from one person to the next, scanning the faces of the civilians. She didn't speak much, but Leo could sense her unease. She was no stranger to trauma, but the sight of helpless families, innocent lives torn apart, seemed to unsettle her. Something's off, Naira muttered under her breath, her voice low but sharp. Leo turned to her, brow furrowed. What do you mean? I'm not sure, she said, her gaze flicking toward the far side of the square. But we've been too quiet. They'll be back, and when they do, they'll be ready. Leo could feel the tension building in his chest. He knew Naira was right. The slavers weren't done yet. But what could they do? They had to get the civilians to safety first. The Aegis was only a short distance away, and if they could just hold out until the transport ships arrived, they could evac everyone off-planet. But that wasn't guaranteed. Nothing ever was. We'll make it, Leo said, trying to inject some calm into his voice. We just need to stay sharp. Naira didn't respond, but she nodded, her posture rigid with readiness. They continued moving through the square, ushering the last of the civilians toward the extraction point. Leo kept his head on a swivel, making sure the perimeter was secure. It wasn't long before he heard the telltale sound of engines in the distance. At first it was faint, a low rumble, but it quickly grew louder and Leo's heart skipped a beat. He turned to Vega, who had positioned herself at the edge of the square, looking through her binoculars. They're coming, she said, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. But we've got more problems. There's a backup force inbound. Looks like the slavers are regrouping for a final push. Leo swore under his breath. How much time do we have? 10 minutes, maybe less, Vega replied, lowering her binoculars. It's going to be close. We'll have to hold them off until the evac ships arrive, Leo said, already assessing the situation in his mind. Naira, stay by me. We'll take the front. The rest of you, secure the civilians and keep them moving. No one gets left behind. Naira didn't hesitate. She gave Leo a curt nod and moved into position, her posture alert. Leo's heart thrummed in his chest, his senses sharpening. The quiet had returned, but he knew better than to trust it. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke again. They took their positions, Leo and Naira positioned near the entrance of the square, their backs to the buildings for cover. The rest of the team formed a loose perimeter around the civilians, ready to defend them at all costs. The rumble of the slaver engines grew louder, closer. Leo's fingers tightened around his weapon. He could feel the tension building with each passing second. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His team was ready. Naira, too, was poised, her body coiled with the kind of focus Leo had seen only in seasoned fighters. The first wave hit faster than Leo had anticipated. Blaster fire erupted from the far side of the square, and the first slaver vehicle screeched to a halt, its ramp lowering to release a dozen heavily armored soldiers. The air was thick with the crackle of energy weapons as the slavers opened fire, their shots searing through the air toward the civilians. Leo's team didn't wait. They immediately returned fire, their shots finding their targets with deadly accuracy. Leo's pulse quickened as he fired, watching as the first slaver fell to the ground with a loud thud. But there were more, many more. And the slavers weren't pulling punches this time. Stay low. Leo shouted, signaling to the civilians to take cover behind the nearest buildings. His team formed a wall of fire, their weapons blazing as they fought to repel the incoming assault. Naira moved beside him, her energy whip already in her hands, its crackling tendrils slicing through the air as she lashed it toward an approaching slaver soldier. Her strike was swift, precise, and the slaver was sent sprawling, disoriented. But before he could react, Naira was already on top of him, landing a lethal blow to his chest. Leo's breath caught in his throat as he watched her fight. There was no hesitation, no fear in her actions, only the cold certainty of someone who had faced death before and had learned how to conquer it. Nice work, Leo muttered, though his eyes were still on the battlefield. The slavers weren't giving up easily and they were closing in fast. They had brought in reinforcements, heavier firepower and more vehicles. They're pushing through, Vega's voice crackled over the comms. We need to hold them back, Captain. The evac ships are almost here but not yet. Leo's jaw tightened. We can't let them take the civilians. Hold the line. The battle intensified, the air thick with the hum of energy blasts and the cries of wounded soldiers. Leo could see the desperation in the faces of the slavers now. They knew they were losing, but they weren't going to let it go without a fight. And then, just as Leo was about to fire again, a sound that chilled him to his core filled the air. The unmistakable whine of an incoming missile. Incoming? Vega shouted. Leo dove to the ground, grabbing Naira by the arm and pulling her down with him. The explosion was deafening, a shockwave that rattled his bones and sent dust and debris flying. For a moment, Leo was disoriented, his ears ringing, but he quickly shook it off. The battlefield was still there and the fight was far from over. Get up, he shouted, pulling Naira to her feet. We've got to finish this. Together they moved to the front, weapons raised, ready to defend their people. The slavers had underestimated them before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The unseen enemy ***. The explosion had torn through the center of the square, sending civilians scrambling for cover. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning fuel. Leo's heart pounded in his chest, and his eyes scanned the chaotic battlefield, looking for any signs of the next assault. The slavers were still pushing forward, their reinforcements flooding into the square. The weapons fire intensified, the crackle of energy blasts and the boom of grenades reverberating in his ears. Leo could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about holding the line. This was about saving lives. Vega, status report. Leo barked over the comms, his voice cutting through the noise. Still holding, Vega's voice responded, but there was a tightness to it, a hint of strain. We've lost a few, but the civilians are mostly safe for now. We're holding them at the northern edge, but they're breaking through. Leo gritted his teeth, feeling the anxiety claw at him. The civilians were close now, but they still had to make it to the evacuation point. Every second mattered. Keep the perimeter tight, Leo ordered, snapping his attention back to the field ahead. We're not letting them through. Naira, stay close. She nodded, her posture still tense, her eyes scanning the battlefield. Her alien reflexes were on high alert, her energy whip crackling with power in her hands. She had fought with unmatched skill, but Leo couldn't help but sense something darker in her. Something that felt like she was holding herself back. Maybe it was the brutal environment, or perhaps it was the tension from the constant battle, but Leo could feel it. Naira was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. He didn't have time to consider it further, though. The slavers were relentless and they were getting closer. As the enemy surged forward, Leo took a deep breath and leveled his blaster. His fingers squeezed the trigger, sending a volley of plasma rounds into the advancing troops. The shots hit their marks and two slavers dropped instantly, their bodies disintegrating in the blast. Naira was beside him, her movements fluid as she lashed out with her whip, the crack of the weapon slicing through the air with a force that sent another enemy soldier flying. She was unstoppable, her strength and speed making her a force to be reckoned with. But Leo noticed the flicker of something in her eyes, a coldness, a detachment that hadn't been there before. Naira, he called, trying to pull her focus back to the task. Focus. We need to get these civilians out. Her gaze flickered briefly to him, then back to the battlefield. I know, she muttered, but her voice was strained. There was a shadow there, something that made Leo wonder if she was fighting more than just the slavers. The chaos around them intensified. A slaver vehicle, one of their larger, armored transports, had broken through the lines and was now barreling toward the evac zone. It was heavily armored, its cannons locked and loaded, ready to tear apart anything in its path. Incoming, Vega shouted. That transport's going to breach the perimeter. Leo didn't hesitate. Get everyone to the south side of the square. I'll handle this. Without waiting for a response, he turned to Naira. Cover the civilians. I'm taking that transport down. Naira looked at him, her eyes narrowing, her body tense. Be careful, she said, her voice quiet but laced with something deeper. A warning? Or perhaps a plea? Leo didn't have time to question it. He gave her a nod and sprinted toward the armored vehicle, his mind already working through the possibilities. The vehicle was too heavily armored for conventional blaster fire, and its mounted cannons would shred anything in their path. But Leo had dealt with this kind of threat before. It wasn't invincible. He reached the corner of a nearby building and crouched low, his eyes locked on the advancing transport. The slavers were unaware of his position, too focused on the civilians and the chaos surrounding them. Leo's fingers danced over the control panel on his forearm, triggering a set of deployable explosive charges. He sprinted across the open space, his heart hammering in his chest, the rush of adrenaline sharp in his veins. He had to make it to the back of the transport. That's where the weak points were. A few well-placed charges and they could take the whole vehicle down. He couldn't afford to miss. The transport was closer now, its engines roaring as it churned through the square, crushing debris under its massive wheels. Leo gritted his teeth and dove toward the vehicle, rolling behind a large stack of metal crates. The transport's massive guns fired in rapid succession, the blasts thudding into the buildings around him, sending chunks of debris raining down. Leo's breath caught in his throat as a blast struck the ground nearby, sending him tumbling to the dirt. His ears rang and for a moment the world spun. But he didn't stop. He pushed himself up, adrenaline coursing through his body, and sprinted the final distance to the back of the transport. The slavers inside didn't see him coming. They were too focused on the firefight ahead. Leo quickly planted the explosive charges, securing them in key areas around the transport's rear armor. He hit the detonator just as the transport turned to head straight for the evac point. The explosion was deafening, a massive shockwave that rocked the ground beneath him. Leo was thrown back, but he managed to roll with the force, keeping his body from hitting the ground too hard. When the dust settled, the transport was a smoldering wreck, its massive cannon disabled, and its engines sputtering to a halt. The slavers inside the vehicle were either dead or incapacitated, and the remaining troops hesitated, their confidence shaken. "That's how we do it," Leo muttered under his breath, feeling the weight of the battle lift just a little. He quickly checked his surroundings. There was no time to rest. The civilians were still moving toward the evac zone, but the fight wasn't over. More slaver reinforcements were arriving, and the perimeter was still in danger of being overrun. He jogged back to the front lines where Naira was holding her ground. She was surrounded by a half-dozen slavers, but she was cutting through them with brutal efficiency. Her whip snapped through the air, each strike sending a soldier flying, but Leo could see the exhaustion creeping into her movements. She wasn't just fighting the slavers, she was fighting something inside herself. "Naira!" Leo shouted, rushing to her side. She glanced at him, her face a mask of determination, but her eyes betrayed something darker. "They're not stopping, are they?" she asked, her voice strained. Leo shook his head. "No. But we will. We'll stop them together." For the first time Naira's expression softened just a little. She nodded, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. It was as though she was seeing him for the first time in a new light, understanding something that had been left unsaid. And in that moment Leo knew. The fight wasn't just about the slavers anymore. It was about them, about their survival. About the bond that had formed between them, unspoken and yet undeniable. "Let's finish this," Leo said, gripping his weapon tight. And together they charged back into the fray, determined to see the battle through to the end. The cost of victory ****. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt ozone and scorched metal. The battle for the colony had raged for hours, and the streets of the settlement had become a war zone. But Leo's focus was sharp. His eyes on the civilians, his mind calculating the risks, calculating the moves that would keep them safe. "Vega, report," Leo shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. His team had taken down the first wave of slaver forces, but they weren't done yet. More of the enemy were on their way, and Leo knew that every moment counted. "We're almost clear on the north side," Vega's voice came through the comms, sounding strained but steady. "The civilians are moving through the southern passage to the evac zone. But we've got incoming air support, Captain. They've got bombers en route." Leo's heart sank. The air was the last place they needed to be vulnerable. The slavers were relentless and it seemed they were pulling out all the stops. "Hold them off for as long as you can," Leo ordered. "I'll get the civilians to the evac zone. You know what to do." "I'll do my best," Vega replied grimly, and the comm clicked off. Naira was already by his side, her expression unreadable. She'd been fighting like a machine, her energy whip cutting through the slavers with surgical precision. But even she seemed a little worn down now, her eyes slightly dulled, the usual fire within her flickering. "Ready to move?" Leo asked, his voice calm but firm. She nodded without a word, her hands still gripping the whip tightly. "We need to move fast." Without waiting for another word, Leo signaled the others. His team, battered but determined, rallied around him as they pushed forward, guiding the civilians, women, children, the elderly, toward the evacuation zone. The terrain had become increasingly treacherous. Buildings were in ruins, the ground littered with debris and craters from previous blasts. The civilians struggled to keep pace, their fear palpable, but Leo kept his movements purposeful, his voice steady as he urged them on. They had no choice but to trust him, and trust Naira, who had become an unexpected force of hope in the midst of destruction. As they neared the evac zone, a sudden, ominous hum filled the air. Leo's instincts kicked in and he grabbed Naira's arm, pulling her behind a pile of rubble. She glanced at him, her eyes wide with sudden realization. "They've arrived," she muttered. A series of bombers appeared above the horizon, their engines cutting through the smoke-filled sky. The slavers' air support had arrived. The first bomber released its payload, the sound of its bombs falling like a death sentence. The ground trembled as the first blast hit the southern section of the square, and Leo felt the shockwave rattle his bones. He turned to Naira, his voice sharp. "We need to move now." They weren't far from the evac zone, but the bomber runs would only get closer. The slavers knew they couldn't risk losing the civilians. Leo could feel the pressure rising, the stakes growing higher with every passing second. The civilians were moving slower now, panic setting in as the ground shook with each successive bomb. Leo's heart raced as he scanned the area. The transport ships were still a few minutes out, and that was a precious amount of time they might not have. "Vega, status?" Leo shouted into the comms, his voice urgent. "We're holding them back," Vega's strained voice responded, but it was clear the pressure was taking its toll. "The bombers are targeting us, but we're still holding our ground." "Barely." "Hold on for just a little longer," Leo urged, though doubt gnawed at him. They were fighting against the clock, and with every second that ticked by, the risk to the civilians grew. Another blast tore through the air, this one closer to their position. The force of it knocked Leo to the ground and he felt the world spin. His ears rang as debris rained down, and for a moment, everything was a blur. But then Naira's voice cut through the fog. "Captain. We need to move, now." Leo pushed himself to his feet, shaking off the disorientation. "Everyone, move." He didn't wait for anyone to follow. He charged toward the evac zone, Naira close on his heels. The civilians were more scattered now, their fear turning into full-blown panic as the explosions grew more frequent. Leo's mind raced as he calculated the quickest path to safety, his body pushing through the exhaustion that was beginning to settle in his bones. They reached the evac zone just as the second wave of bombers began their descent. Leo's eyes locked on the horizon, his pulse racing. The transport ships were close now, but still too far to offer any real safety. "We've got incoming," Leo muttered under his breath, his fingers twitching at his side. They couldn't wait. They had to act. "Naira," he said, his voice steady despite the terror creeping into his chest. "I need you to cover the civilians. We'll hold the line until the ships arrive." She turned to him, her face unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes that had seen too much, flared with something more than determination. "What are you planning?" "We're going to make sure they don't get another chance to bomb us," Leo said quietly. "We've got one shot at this." Before Naira could protest, Leo moved forward, pulling out a small handheld EMP grenade from his belt. It was a risky move, there was no guarantee it would disable the bombers' targeting systems. But it was the best shot they had. He hurled the grenade toward the sky, watching as it sailed through the air, its trajectory aimed perfectly at the incoming bombers. The EMP exploded in a burst of energy, its shockwave rippling through the air. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. And then the bombers faltered. Their targeting systems were offline. The ships veered off course, their bomb payloads disarmed mid-flight. They were still flying, but the damage had been done. The remaining slavers had no air support, no way to stop the evac. "We did it." Vega's voice crackled over the comms, relief and disbelief in her tone. "The bombers are down. Evac ships are landing." Leo didn't have time to feel the rush of triumph. He turned back to the civilians, who were now moving with more urgency as they made their way toward the ships. Naira was already at their side, her whip crackling in the air as she cleared the last of the slavers who had tried to make a last-ditch stand. The civilians were safe, finally, but Leo's mind was still racing. There were still a few pockets of resistance out there. The fight wasn't over, not yet. "Cover the rear," Leo ordered as he jogged to the front of the evac line. He knew the ships would be their final escape, but the slavers had a nasty habit of trying to pull one last stunt, and Leo wasn't about to let them. The first transport ship landed with a heavy thud, its ramp lowering to allow the civilians inside. The rest of the evac ships followed shortly after, the air buzzing with the whine of their engines. But just as the last civilian stepped onto the final ship, Leo's comm buzzed. It was Vega. "Captain, we've got a problem. A last-ditch unit just arrived, ground forces. They're targeting the evac ships." Leo's gut churned. It wasn't over yet. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Vega said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need you now, Captain. We need a diversion. Quick. Leo's mind clicked into overdrive. Naira, we're not done yet. She turned to him, her expression more focused than it had been in hours. Let's finish this. The final stand ***. The sounds of distant explosions echoed through the ruined streets, but Leo's focus was solely on the immediate threat. The last of the civilians had boarded the evac ships, but the slavers had one last card to play, an elite ground force heavily armed and determined to finish what they'd started. If Leo and Naira didn't act quickly, the evacuation could still be turned into a disaster. Vega, what's their location? Leo barked, pulling himself back into full military mode. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, but there was no room for fear, no room for doubt. He had made it this far. He couldn't let the enemy take this last victory. They're setting up at the west perimeter. Vega's voice crackled over the comms, her tone clipped. They're fortified. It'll take everything we've got to breach their defenses. We'll need a distraction. Leo didn't waste time responding. He turned to Naira, who was already reloading her weapon, her face hard with resolve. There was no fear in her eyes now, just a single-minded focus. She had been through too much, fought too hard, and endured too many losses to back down now. We go in fast, hit them hard, and give the evac ships time to leave, Leo said, his voice grim. We'll cover the rear for as long as it takes. Naira nodded, her lips pulling into a tight, determined line. Let's end this. They sprinted toward the west perimeter, moving in the shadows to avoid detection. The elite slaver ground forces were entrenched, their positions well defended by a mix of heavy artillery and infantry. Leo knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The enemy wasn't just trying to slow them down, they were determined to stop the evacuation at all costs. As they neared the perimeter, Leo signaled Naira to take cover behind a crumbled wall. He could see the slaver forces ahead, positioned behind barricades and reinforced with energy shields. The ground forces had heavy blasters aimed in their direction, scanning for any signs of movement. We're going to hit them hard and fast, Leo whispered, his breath steady, his mind already working through their strategy. We break their front lines, create chaos, and give the ships time to clear out. You cover the right flank. I'll take the left. Without waiting for any further confirmation, Leo moved first, sprinting across the open ground with Naira right behind him. The moment they broke cover, the slavers saw them. A barrage of blaster fire lit up the air as the slaver soldiers opened fire. Leo ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding a direct hit as plasma rounds sizzled past him. Naira was already in motion, her energy whip crackling with an almost deafening sound as it lashed out, taking down two of the slaver soldiers in one swift, deadly strike. She was a blur of motion, faster and more lethal than any human could hope to be. Leo took advantage of the opening Naira created, charging toward the enemy's left flank, his own blaster drawn and firing in rapid succession. Each shot found its mark, striking slavers down as they scrambled to react. The ground around them trembled with the force of explosions and blaster fire. Don't let up. Leo shouted to Naira, his voice rising above the chaos. Push them back, now. Naira's energy whip lashed out again, taking down another soldier with brutal precision. She spun, her movements fluid, almost like she was dancing, but with the deadly purpose of a predator closing in on its prey. Leo watched in awe, not for the first time, as she fought with a savagery that was both beautiful and terrifying. But even Naira's extraordinary abilities couldn't clear the battlefield alone. The slavers were entrenched and organized, and they were starting to regroup. Leo sprinted toward a cluster of slaver soldiers, using a discarded shield as cover as he advanced. He could hear their voices over the din of battle, shouting orders, trying to reorganize their lines. They were close now, too close. With a final, determined yell, Leo hurled a grenade into the center of their ranks. It exploded with a deafening crack, sending debris and soldiers flying in all directions. The shockwave threw Leo to the ground, but he was up again in an instant, his blaster in hand. Vega, how are we looking? Leo shouted into the comms, his breath ragged from the exertion. Evac ships are almost clear, Captain. Vega's voice crackled through, relief clear in her tone. We've bought enough time. But the slavers are still making a push. They'll be on you in seconds. Then we end this, Leo said, his voice low and fierce. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but there was no time to waste. He was fighting for more than survival now, he was fighting for the lives of everyone on the ships, for the people who had trusted him to protect them. Naira's whip lashed out again, cutting through another group of soldiers as they tried to regroup. She moved like lightning, too fast for most of the slavers to react. Leo fired into the remaining soldiers, his blaster steady as he picked off targets, one by one. The slavers were losing ground fast, their carefully coordinated defense breaking apart. Just as it seemed like they had the upper hand, the ground shook with another, more intense explosion. Leo turned just in time to see a large slaver transport vehicle emerge from behind a building, its weapon systems locked on their position. "Incoming!" Leo shouted, diving for cover behind a broken wall. "We need to neutralize that transport, now." Naira turned to him, her expression unreadable. Without waiting for further orders, she sprinted toward the incoming vehicle, her energy whip crackling as she cut down anyone who got in her way. Leo knew she could handle herself. She had proven that time and time again. But the transport was heavily armored, and they needed to disable it before it could turn its weapons on the evac ships. He took a deep breath, pushing aside the pain that was beginning to creep into his body. There was no time for weakness. He pulled out a second EMP grenade, this one more powerful than the last, and sprinted toward the vehicle. The slavers were distracted by Naira, their focus diverted as they tried to fend off her assault. Leo moved quickly, throwing the grenade at the transport's engine core. The EMP detonated, sending a wave of energy rippling through the air. The transport shuddered and stalled, its weapons powering down as its engine sputtered. The slavers inside the vehicle were thrown into disarray, unable to respond as the ship's systems locked up. With a final, furious push, Naira finished off the remaining soldiers around the transport, clearing the way for Leo. They were done. The slavers had been crushed under the weight of their own desperation. Leo turned to Naira, his breath heavy, his chest aching from the effort. "It's over," he said, though he couldn't quite believe it. For a long moment, Naira didn't say anything. She stood there, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath, her eyes scanning the now quiet battlefield. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, almost reflective. "It is," she said, a hint of something more in her tone. "We've won." But Leo knew better than to think the victory came without cost. The battle had taken everything they had, and more. But as he looked around at the evac ships, already lifting off and disappearing into the sky, he knew that they had done what they set out to do. They had saved them all. As Naira approached him, her eyes met his, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, Leo felt a sense of peace. They had fought together, and together they had survived. The war wasn't over. The battle had been won, but the struggle was far from finished. But for now they had done what was needed. And as the last evac ship soared into the sky, Leo knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.